Hello. As promised, I'm going to go over the more advanced ways to do what we did in the previous lesson, in the previous video. We're going to do this parent constraint thing, but this time we're going to make it a nice little function, and we're going to do a few other cool things like check for if an attribute is locked, then it'll switch the command to doing something slightly different. So if you look at this rig here, and I just have this pole vector selected, and if I come over to the channel box, you can see that my rotations are locked. And that's going to be a problem. You can't constrain to something with locked rotations, or like a regular parent constraint, I should say. But what we can do is we can do a parent constraint, but we can skip rotations. So it'll still try to do the parent constraint, except this time it'll just do it to the translates. And it's a little bit different to just doing a point constraint. I'll just quickly show you guys why. So if I create a locator here, and I want this pole vector to be constrained to this locator right around here. So if I do a point constraint, and let's see what that does. So it appears like it's doing the right thing, but when I try to rotate it, you can see the pole vector isn't behaving like a parent constraint. You know, it's only respecting the translations. So if I just come back and let's just delete that constraint, and now I do something else where I create a constraint, a parent constraint this time, and then I uncheck rotations. So if you hit apply now, you can see when I rotate it now, it's actually behaving like a parent constraint, even though it's just doing the translations. So that's an important distinction to understand. And we can do the same thing with a Python command just by, using a little flag. So there's a cool thing you can actually do is if you type in parent constraint. So if you type in the command name itself, whether it be cmds.parentConstraint, or if you're using PyML or whatever, you can, have PM there. But the trick is, if you see this blue highlighting inside of the script editor, you can actually just select it and then, do help in this little help section and help on selected command. And what that will do is it will jump you straight to the command itself inside of the documentation and save you having to go through the documentation and search for the command name itself. So it's a neat little trick there. And if you look at this parent constraint command, you can see if I come over here, there's a little flag that says skip rotate. So if I click on this skip rotate, it'll jump me down to what this skip rotate flag does. It says causes the axis specified to not be considered when constraining rotations. So it's exactly the same as what we did inside of the parent constraint options by unchecking the rotations. So it's just a nice little thing that you can do with this parent constraint command. And we're going to use that later in order to swap between constraining just translations and constraining rotations and translations on these other controls. So this time I'm going to actually come into PyCharm and then use PyCharm. If you guys don't know how to, start using PyCharm, I have a nice little video kind of running you through all the steps that you need to take in order to get PyCharm up and running and to be able to import your scripts from, within that you do within PyCharm inside of Maya itself. So yeah, make sure you check that video. I'll put a link in the description. So I just created this test file here. I'm just gonna delete this guy because I don't actually want it. And I've got just a simple project set up. I've got a top level project folder, and then inside there I've got a little package called fun. So you can tell it's a Python package because it's got this init.py, and it's important that we have this init.py here in order for Python to be able to import this package's code. So once that is kind of set up, I can create a new Python file. And then this one, I'm just going to call this smart parent constraint. And that's just what I'm calling my code, smart parent constraint. So, once that's kind of done, what we can do is let's import my.cmds as cmds. That's kind of our, usual thing that we normally do in order to get the code to be able to be read. And then I just want to print confirmed. So I'm just doing a little test here just to make sure that when I import this entire script, that it's actually going to work within Maya. And then I'll just quickly save that file. And in here I can do import. Let's import my my project, which is called fun. You can see my fun project there. So let's import fun, and fun dot, I want to actually import the script itself, so it needs to be inside of fun. So smart parent constraint, fun.smart parent constraint. And now if I run this code, you can see I get no errors and I get this confirmed printout. And that's how you know that it's actually worked, it's actually imported the script. So that's very important. And then now I can just come back here and just delete that line because I don't actually need it. And then let's begin by, let's create a new function. This function I'm going to call transform lock state. So what this is going to do, I'm just going to type pass there. So what this function is going to do is it's going to check whatever we have selected or whatever we pass to this function. I'm going to pass an object to this function, and whatever object gets passed to that function, the script is going to check whether the channels are locked, which channels are locked, and if it's locked, then it'll switch the command, or maybe it'll just skip the control entirely. So it's important that we actually give this something to operate on. So we want to pass an object to it. And then, as always, you can test whether the code's working or not by just printing object. And then we can do a small little test here. We'll need to reload our code because we've now adjusted it from whatever it is in memory. So you can just type a little reload there, run this code. That's kind of reloaded the code. And then we can do fun.smart parent constraint. And then we just want to access within that our little function that we just wrote, which is transform lock state. Okay. And then in here, what do we want to do? Well, let's also import my.cmds as cmds. Let me just open this up so we get a little bit more space. And in here, I want to get our selection. Let's put that on a new line to make it a little bit more clear. So cmds.ls sl is equal to true. And then let's just pass our selection to this object, our first selection. So if I run this now, you can see it's going to print the name of the control. And that's just because we've put the print statement there. So we know it's working. We know it's taking the, taking whatever we pass to it, and we can do something within there. So let's keep going. This time now we need to figure out which attributes we need to, loop over in order to check the constraints for. So the nicest way to do that, I think, is, there's a few different ways we can do CMDS. The important thing is we're using the CMDS getAttr function, and that will actually get the attribute. But what do we want to get from the attribute? So let's just do something like, let's use a little placeholder here. And then let's do .translate x, for example. And then let's format the string to use our object. So we're just using a little bit of string formatting. Shouldn't be anything too new. We've kind of done a few of these things in the past. Just making a new line so that it's a little bit clearer what our function's doing, so we don't have this giant line. So what we actually need to do is, let's take a look at the getAttr command and see what's available to us. Because what I want to do is get whether an attribute is locked or not. I don't actually want to get the values for the attribute. And by default, the getAttr function, if I just pass the selected object to this, the getAtta function will it'll actually just try to get the value of the object. So let's get translate x and doing the same thing here where we format. So if I run this, you can see it's just getting the value of the translate x, you know, of this, of whatever we have selected. And it's actually giving me this tiny minuscule value. That's because even though it says 0 here, there's a tiny little minuscule value. But if I just type 0 and I run this again, it should give me just 0. You know, so that's what getAtta does by default. But how do we check if an attribute is locked or not? Well, let's just take a look at the documentation. So let's do help on selected command. And that's just going to jump us to getAtta. And what I want to see is, okay, so there's a lock flag here that we can pass. So I can click on this and it says returns the lock state of the attribute. So that's pretty interesting. So let's come back to here now. And now if we just apply that, let's just do that lock flag here. And now if I run, I'm going to get a totally different result. You can see it's saying false. So what it's checking for is whether an attribute is locked or not. So I can actually come here, and we know that just by looking at the channel box that our rotations are locked. So I'm going to grab this translate and I'm going to change this to rotate X. And now let's run this command, see what we get. Okay, so it's returning true, so we know that the rotation X is locked because this command is telling us that it's true. And we can use that now. We can use that in a way to check whether these attributes are locked or not. So let's come back over to PyCharm and let's apply that. Let's do the lock flag. So we say lock is equal to true. So now what this is going to do is this command is going to check whether an attribute's locked, and we can store that value, whether it's locked or not. Let's store that value somehow. Let's say state is equal to getAtta, and then this is the attribute we're getting, translate X. I don't want to hard code this translate X value into here, and I'm going to show you guys a smart way to just loop over all the attributes. But for now, let's just do this and save the file. And then maybe let's actually print the state so we can verify whether this is working or not. And let's save, come back over to here. So now this code can all be the same because we're just kind of running this code using our first selection for now. So let's run this again, and you can see it's saying false because our translate X is not locked. So how do we loop over all the attributes and check, you know, whether each attribute is locked or not? Well, I think the first way to do that, rather than manually typing this out, because we can always come here and grab this and, you know, just kind of like repeat the process and do like state translate Y and then change this value to Y. And then, you know, we'll have just a ton of attributes, a ton of variables and a ton of lines of code, just kind of repeating the same thing over and over again. And that's never smart. So a smart way to do this is to create a for loop that kind of loops over all the attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually define a set of attributes that we want to loop over. So what I can do is I'm going to show you guys a cool little thing called dict from keys. So what this does, this dict from keys, it creates a dictionary from a set of keys. So let's come back over to the script editor. I'm going to show you guys how to do this. So what a dictionary is it's kind of like a 2-row column. It's like a 2-column table. If you think of like an Excel spreadsheet, you know, where you have 2 columns and one column is kind of, you know, like the object, and then the second column would be like the values. So that's what a dictionary is. So let me just briefly go over what a dictionary is here. So to define a dictionary, you just use these curly brackets here like that. And then you can give a key value pair, I think is what they call it. You know, I never bothered to remember what the actual terminology for this is, but I think it's a key value pair. So what I can do is I can store this in a variable, and let's just say my dict. Okay, and if I run this now, it's going to store it in this dictionary here, and I can access this dictionary by just, accessing the key. So I've set the key to be A here, and the value for A is 10. So when I run this, you can see I get a value of 10. And then if I want to query the value of B, I can, change that to B and run this. And now I get 15 because B is 15. So in a nutshell, that's what it is. So if you think of this as a table, the table would look something like this, where, I have the first column is just whatever object, and the second column is whatever value. So this is the key and this is the value. That's just a little summary of what a dictionary is. And you can create a dictionary really quickly rather than just typing it out like this. What we can do is use from keys, .from keys. So dict.from keys, and this is built into Python, so you can use it, anywhere where you can use Python. It's kind of native to the language. So what do I want to create a dictionary from? So we actually need to use a collection in here. So I'm using a tuple. You can use a list. It doesn't really matter what it is. And we can also create the list beforehand. So we can say, transform attributes. And then I can create a tuple or a list, doesn't really matter. And I can do something like translate, rotate, and scale, like that. And then let's just give this variable to this dict from keys. And if I just print this out, you'll see what happens. And if I run this, you can see it's created a dictionary here, kind of like what we did when we did A equals 10, B equals 15. It's created a new dictionary, and it's using these as the first column, basically. And it's setting the value for the second column, the actual value for these keys, to be none by default. So that's a quick way to create a dictionary. And we're going to use this somehow in order to kind of iterate over all the different transform attributes. So I want to come back to here, and I'm going to say dict from keys. And here I'm going to create a tuple. I don't want to store a variable. Maybe it's overkill for something like this. I'm going to do translate, rotate, and let's do scale, just like that. And dict from keys actually takes an additional flag. So this is, an additional argument, which is a cool little thing. So rather than it being none as the default value, you can actually specify a default value. So I can say 1. If I run this, you can see it's created a dictionary, but all the values have kind of been changed from none to 1. And we can use this to our advantage somehow. So I want to actually use false as the default value. So, we're going to say like, hey, we're going to set all the default values to be false first. So we're going to say like all the channels are not locked. We're assuming that none of the channels are locked. And then we're going to iterate over all the channels. And if it finds a locked channel, it's going to swap this from false to being true. So that's just how we're going to, think about this code. So I'm going to come here and just type false as my default value. And now I have this, I'm going to give it S attributes dictionary. And then what we can do is loop over this. So I can say for attribute in attributes dot keys. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, we want just the keys. We want to loop over and we want to store the keys for this. So let's just quickly take a look at how this works. So if I store this in a temporary variable called foo, run this, and now if I look at foo, you can see, okay, it's giving me a dictionary, and inside that dictionary, it's got, all the values that I've kind of stored. But I can loop over this dictionary. So I can say for I in foo.keys, this dot keys will basically store all the keys. So it will treat all the keys as a list. So if I kind of just copy this and run this on its own, you can kind of see what it's doing. It's kind of giving me back a list of just the keys. And if you remember, it's just like any other list that we have. We can iterate over the list. So, first iteration will be translate, second iteration will be rotate, third will be scale. and so on and so forth. And it'll store that in this little temporary I variable. So I can just do print I. So now you can see what happens. It's just going to print out all the keys. So we're going to use this to kind of loop over all these translate, rotate, and scale keys, the strings, and we're going to use the string itself inside of this CMDS command. So I can come here now and I'll just grab this code and I'll paste it inside here. And then now you can see instead of translate X, we can use this little placeholder. So kind of, taking advantage of how we're storing this in this little temporary variable, this temporary attribute variable. So now I can come here and type attribute. And then you can see we still have to manually change the axis, and that's no good. We don't want to have to manually change the axis. So what I can do is I can create another loop. So here I want to create axis, and I'll just define an axis. So I want to say X, Y, and Z. So I'm defining all my 3 axes here. And here I can now create a new placeholder, and we have to do another loop as well. So we have to do for A in axis, and just indent this code, and let's put A here. So now what it's going to do is it's going to loop over all the translate, these translate, rotate, and scales. And then it's also going to, within each loop, we're going to do another loop where we're saying X, Y, Z for, each one of these different axes for these channels. And then we're just formatting all this using our little, this little for loop trick. We're saying, attribute and the axis. So it's going to be the object name, and then translate, rotate, or scale in this little placeholder. And then the third thing is it's going to be, either X, Y, or Z in this very last thing. So this is just a quick way to kind of get the state. And then what are we going to do with the state? So I can just do a little print to show you guys what this is doing. So we're not storing any of these values or doing anything with this just yet, but I'm just going to save this code, and we're going to loop over all these different channels and these different axes, and then we're just going to print the state. So I don't need any of this code. Coming back up to our code here, we don't need to change any of it. We can just run this. You can say it's saying false, false, and then true, 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 true. That's because our first 3 channels would be the translates, and they're not locked. So we're good with these ones. But then when we come to the rotations are locked. So it's saying true, yeah, the rotations are locked. And then we're going to do the scales, and then it's going to say true to those 2 because the scales are locked. And if I just select this control, this cog control here, you can see we've got translate, rotate, and scale. None of these are locked. And if I run this code, you can see it's saying false to all of them because none of them are locked. So that's just a neat little way you can kind of, iterate over all the different attributes and check whether something is locked or not. I can come to something like this control, this IK-FK switch control, and all the channels are locked here. So if I run this, you can see it's returning true for all of them because they're all locked. And this is just a nice little neat way to check, but what we can do is we don't want to just, print the state of it. It's not going to be very helpful to us. We actually need to return the state. So what I can do here is I can say attributes, and then I want to access this dictionary. Remember, this attributes is our dictionary here, and all the values are false by default. And if we find a true value, what I want to do is set the dictionary value for any one of these transform components to being either true or false. So it's all false by default, but if it's locked, then we're going to set it to true. So here, what I can do is attribute. So rather than typing translate, rotate, or scale to access this dictionary, what I'm doing is I'm just using this variable here that we're kind of, when we're looping over this thing. And then I'm going to say is equal to true, but I don't want to just do it like, like this. I want to actually check whether the state is true or false first. So I say if state, then do this. So what does this mean? So if the state is true, so if we run this command and it's locked, it is indeed locked. I'm saying if state, so state is a true or false value, and if it's true, then we're going to set this dictionary value to be true for this particular component. So finally, what I want to do is actually just return attributes. So we're returning this dictionary now. So I can come back here, and if I run this code, you can see it's not going to print anything out this time, but what this line actually does now is it returns a dictionary, and inside that dictionary it says, you know, rotate true, scale true, translate true. And that's because I have this thing selected and all the transforms are locked. But if I come here and I select this control and I run this, you can now see, okay, I get a dictionary back, and you know, oh, I need to run this whole code again, just so we renew our selection. And now you can see it's the rotations are locked, scales are locked, but the translates aren't locked. That's why it's false. So that's just a neat little way to kind of write a function that kind of checks all the transform attributes and returns a dictionary with all the states of these transform attributes, whether they're locked or not. And that's how you guys write the transform lock state function. I could have probably named it a little bit better. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but you know, in the next lesson, I'm going to split it off into another part because this video is running a little bit long. But in the next lesson, we're going to reuse this transform lock state function inside of another function, the final function that we're going to write, which kind of combines what we've done in the last 2 lessons, and we kind of create a smart constraint that checks whether things are locked, and if it is, changes up the parent constraint command, and that way you won't get errors when you're running the code. And that's always a nice thing, not getting any errors when you run code. So make sure you stick around.